Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. We're in Daniel chapter 8 tonight. And this is one of the chapters where there's a really strong consensus about what this is about. Even people who have widely divergent understandings of the meaning of the statue or the meaning of the four beasts or who the little horn is. When we read chapter 8, everybody's kind of on the same page with chapter 8 because it's very specific, and it's identified and interpreted in ways that seem fairly clear historically. And as we look at the language and we look at the history, we can see the correlation and understand Daniel chapter 8. So almost everyone, as far as I know, I'm sure there's outliers out there that are not, this would not be true of, but as far as I know, everybody sort of is on this, they agree on chapter 8. Now, remember that chapter 8 is the beginning of Hebrew again. Chapter 7 was still in Aramaic. From chapter 2 to chapter 7 was in the Aramaic language, which was kind of the international language of Daniel's time or thereafter. It would ultimately be the language that Jesus probably spoke the most, Aramaic. It became the language of Judea and the people of Israel in the time of Jesus, for the most part. They could still speak a little Greek here, and they could still read Hebrew, but Aramaic was the language. We have a lot of examples of say letters that are in Latin, Aramaic, and Greek. And then the Hebrew Bible, of course, is Hebrew. So they were multilingual people in the first century, which makes them sometimes a little smarter than the rest of us, right? Because we're not typically multilingual, right? So we're not talking about dumb people. And these are people who are intelligent. But as we come to chapter 8, we begin the Hebrew section again. Chapter 1 is Hebrew, and now in chapter 8 we have Hebrew. And it will go through the end of the book. And if you remember, chapter 7 was the beginning of apocalyptic language of symbolism, language that is about the conflict between good and evil, and the kind of cosmic nature of that conflict between the forces of evil and the forces of good, and that empires have represented that. And we saw that last week in chapter 7 with the four beasts. The four beasts, the lion and the bear and the leopard, and then the unidentified, not identified with any particular animal, which paralleled the statue with its gold, silver, bronze, and iron. So you had the four parts of the statue, and then you had the four beasts, and that was chapter 2 and chapter 7. And that kind of rounds out 2 to 7 and the Aramaic of Daniel. And you remember in chapters 3 and 6, we had the persecution of the saints, right? The three in the fire in chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire. And then we had Daniel, where was Daniel? Lion's den, right? And then in chapters 4 and 5, we had judgment against the ruling kings of Babylon, right? Nebuchadnezzar, who in his pride, God sent him out as an animal in the field, right? And taught him a lesson, you might say. And then in chapter 5, it's Belshazzar, who sees the handwriting on the wall and loses his kingdom that night. So 2 and 6 went together, 2 and 7, 2 and 7 went together, 3 and 6 went together, and 4 and 5 went together, right? So now in chapter 8, it's kind of like, okay, we've been told this story in chapter 7 and in chapter 2 about the statue and the beast, and then, the statue is toppled by a rock, that is thrown from heaven, you might say, and the kingdom of God topples the statue. And the Ancient of Days comes in judgment against the beast, and that fourth beast, the unidentified beast, is destroyed at the coming of the Ancient of Days and is judged at the Ancient of Days, particularly the little horn, who is the representative of that unidentified beast, and is destroyed by the coming of the kingdom of God. So when we come to chapter 8, it's kind of like, well, we've been told the story. The story's already done. We know the four empires. We talked about the different opinions about those, and we're going to get to that more later on in Daniel. But we've been told the story, but then what does chapter 8 add? Why do we have more to the story? And that's what the rest of Daniel is about. It's more to the about the story of the statue and the beast. Right? So what more is there to tell? Well, hopefully, we hope it's a lot more to tell, because we're kind of left at the end of chapter 7 saying, I don't know what this is. I don't know what the final solution here is. And so it'd be good to get more of the story so that we can see it more clearly. And that's part of what chapter 8 does. Now, as we look at chapter 8, and we see these four empires, the gold and the lion, the silver and the bear, and then we have the bronze and the leper, and then we have the iron and the unidentified animal. When we come to chapter 8, so these are the four empires. When we come to chapter 8, we have the ram and the goat. The ram and the goat. So we're switching animals. It's not the same animals, different animals. But this time it's a ram and a goat. And you can imagine a ram and a goat fighting each other. And you can kind of get that picture in your head of a ram and a goat going after it. And the question becomes, who's the empire of the ram over here? Which one is it identified with? And then which one is the goat identified with? Well, we're told in the text that the ram is the Medes and the Persians. And then we're told that the goat is Greece. So we're actually given a very specific identification. Now, here's the problem question. Do we look at the ram as a one-to-one with the silver and the bear? In other words, is this the ram? Or, remember, there's one view that says the bear is the Medes and the leopard is the Persians, right? So that the ram really represents both of these, not just one, but both of them. Because as we read the text, watch carefully when it says the ram has two horns, but one was before the other. And then the second horn became larger than the first horn. So you got a ram with two horns, one small, one large, but the small one came first, and then the second one became great and large. And some suggest that represents that we're talking about two empires here, the Mede Empire and then the Persian Empire, which would make one parallel to the bear and two parallel to the leopard. And that's where it gets a little complicated, right? So as we read through, watch for that, and watch for what it says about Greece, about the goat, because the goat, Greece is going to be, okay, there's going to be one king, and then there are going to be 4 kings. And then out of one of those 4 is going to come a great king, or a blasphemous king, or another little horn, you might say. So watch for how the symbolism unfolds. So let's read our text. I think it's short enough that we can read it all together here, the whole thing, get it in our minds. Daniel chapter 8. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me at first, the one back in chapter 7. In the vision, I was looking and saw myself in Susa, the capital, in the province of Elam, and I was by the river of Ulai. I looked up and saw a ram standing beside the river. It had 2 horns. Both horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up second. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. All beasts were powerless to withstand it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became strong. As I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a horn between its eyes. It came toward the ram with the 2 horns that I'd seen standing beside the river, and it ran at it with savage force. I saw it approaching the ram. It was enraged against it and struck the ram, breaking its 2 horns. The ram did not have power to withstand it. It threw the ram down to the ground and trampled upon it, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from its power. Then the male goat became exceedingly great. But at the height of its power, the great horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 prominent horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to the earth some of the host and some of the stars and trampled on them. Even against the prince of the host, it acted arrogantly. It took the regular burnt offering away from him and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Because of wickedness, the host was given over to it together with the regular burnt offering. It cast truth to the ground and kept prospering in what it did. Then I heard a holy one speaking. Another holy one said to the one that spoke, "For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled?" And he answered him, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I tried to understand it. Then someone appeared standing before me, having the appearance of a man, and I heard a human voice from the Ulai saying, "Gabriel, this man, help him understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I became frightened and fell prostrate. But he said to me, "Understand, O mortal, that the vision is for the time of the end." As he was speaking to me, I fell into a trance, face to the ground. Then he touched me and set me on my feet. He said, "Listen, and I will tell you what will take place later in the period of wrath. For it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between its eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. At the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue. He shall grow strong in power, shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does. He shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall be great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken, and not by human hands. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. As for you, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. So I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business. But I was dismayed by the vision and did not understand it. Even with the interpretation, he didn't understand it. Right? Distressful to him. What is this? What? I don't know what it's talking about. Right? Daniel doesn't understand the vision itself. He's told to seal it up because it's not happening in your lifetime, Daniel. Seal could be put it in safekeeping, or seal could be kind of hide it. It's not, don't read it out. Don't tell people about it right now. Seal it up. Don't publicize this. Don't make it public. And which one it means, people have different opinions about which one it means. I think it's more about protecting it. Write it down, seal it, put it in a safe space, and then when the time comes, then people will be able to see, oh, this is what it was talking about, right? But people have different opinions about that. Well, this is really extraordinary. And one of the things I want us to maybe think about here is, what is the language of when this little horn emerges? What is the language of when is that happening? We're given a couple of phrases. When is it happening? I mean, I don't need a date, but I mean, how is it characterized that this is going to happen and it's going to happen? We're given a couple of phrases there. I'm saying? Well, yeah, I mean, I think who's talking about. I think that's the identification. But in our text, when it talks about when it's going to happen, like in verse 19, the appointed time of the end. Or in verse 19, the period of wrath. Or in verse 17, that the vision is for the time of the end. Okay.
The empire, not necessarily end of time.
Right. Time of the end. Exactly. That's the question. What end are we talking about here? Is it the end of time? Kind of like the last thing that's going to happen before Jesus returns or something like that? Is it that kind of end? Or is it about the end of the little horn? And this period of wrath, is it about the final judgment, that God's going to bring on the world? Or is it only about, no, this time of wrath is the time in which God's going to bring an end or judge the little horn? Right? And most people think that, okay, this is about the end of the little horn, right? Or the end of, not little of horn, but little horn, or the end of the persecution, or the end of what the little horn is doing. What's the little horn doing? Persecuting the saints, okay? But what else is the little horn doing? Tearing up the temple, okay? Destruction of the temple, right? Yeah.
Just wicked evil.
Well, an evil person who is violent and arrogant, thinks of himself as kind of a representative of God, causes the sacrifices to cease. So he stops the temple worship. And so this is I think we're talking about the end of his reign of terror, basically. So this is not a prophecy about something that's still future to us. And I think almost everybody kind of who reads this thinks of, that that's the case, that it is not something about the end of time or something future to us, that this is about an event that happened within history where Greece followed the empire. Who are we talking about? This one king who is Greece, who conquered. Yeah, okay, that's Alexander the Great, isn't it? And remember, he had a very rapid assault on the Persian Empire and overtook it in a matter of few years, which is just striking, amazing. And if you look at the language that describes this ram, I mean the goat, back up in, let's see, where is this? The great horn in verse 8, at the height of its power. And, where's that language of, from the four winds? We have the four that come out, the four horns that come out from the winds. But we have the language of coming from the west. Where is that? Is it up in verse 4?
The ram.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. That's the ram. And the Persians, you remember what out of the four corners of the earth, which one's missing in that list? Yeah, the east is missing. Now, because Persia's in the east, right? So Persia, as it conquers, goes north and south, goes to Egypt, goes up north, and gets west, that is, enters Greece. Remember, Persia actually conquered Athens at one point in its extension of its empire. So it went north, south, and west. But the goat, notice in verse 5, the goat, the male goat, appeared from the west. That is, from Greece, from the west, coming across the face of the whole world, or the whole earth. Now, when you think about what Alexander the Great did in terms of his empire, he started in the west, as far as where Daniel is sitting, right? He's in Babylon. So he's sitting in Babylon, and he's to the east of Greece. And so Greece, Alexander the Great, comes from the west and goes across the whole earth. Now, he didn't go to China, right? He didn't get into North America or South America, but he went the whole earth. Now, what's the whole? The whole earth is not the whole earth, right? It's the region. It's the whole earth to these people, right? It's not the whole earth in a cosmic sense. It's the whole earth in historic sense. That is, he conquered the Persians, and he went all the way to India. Right? He went down to Egypt. He went up to the Black Sea. So he went north, south, and east and covered the whole earth. Right? That's why we have to be careful with this language. You know, sometimes in reading Daniel, we get that whole earth language, and people think, oh, that's globalization or something of that nature. But it's not whole earth in the sense in which we experience it, but it's whole earth in the sense in which the author is experiencing it. Right? So I think that's an important to get our bearings, get our geographical bearings. Right? So Persia starts in the east and conquers towards the west and north and south. Then Greece starts in the west and then conquers north, south, and east, right? Covering the whole earth, at least the earth that was important to these empires. Right? So when we get to Alexander the Great here, and he dies, remember, he dies young. He's not able to consolidate everything and fix everything up the way he wants it. But when he dies, he leaves it to four generals who then represent four different kingdoms, right? The four generals. And I think I list those kingdoms here somewhere, don't I? On the handout. Yeah, the four kingdoms on the back. Under who is the little horn? The four kingdoms are Macedonia, Thrace, Syria, and Egypt. In other words, it's north, south, east, and west. So the Greek Empire is divided into four kingdoms. And then we're told, out of the four kingdoms, one of those kingdoms is going to arise a little horn. And this little horn, almost everyone agrees, is the fellow by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And Epiphanes is the name he gave himself. And Epiphanes, think about epiphany, you know, like an epiphany, you get a revelation from God, right? An epiphany. So he's a manifestation of God. That's what he thought he was. Thought he was a manifestation. He didn't think he was God himself, but he thought he was a manifestation of God. Right? And when you look at the description that we have in Daniel 8, it really does fit this Antiochus fellow. He was actually Antiochus IV. His father was the third, and he was not actually the heir. He had two older brothers. And so Antiochus III dies, and he supplants in some way his two brothers, and he takes on power. It's a little murky about all of that, but he becomes the one who reigns in the place of his father. And the description that we have, let's pay attention to what Daniel says here. Let's look at the vision itself first. In verse 9, out of one of those four kingdoms that are like the four winds of heaven, right? North, east, south, west, the four winds. So it's over the whole earth. From Greece, what we call Greece, to what we call India, right? What we call Black Sea, to Egypt. And the four kingdoms were divided up, that territory. Out of one of them came another horn, a little one. Now remember, we had a little horn in chapter 7 too, didn't we? So one of the questions is, are we talking about the same horn? That's where people differ. You know, that's where people will say, well, no. And others say, yeah, well, of course. You know, we got two little horns or we got one little horn? You know, that becomes the question. But this little horn, which grew exceedingly great, now notice this little horn is with the Seleucid Empire, which the Seleucid Empire is, okay, if you got Greece over here, and then you have Asia Minor, you got Thrace, and then you have Egypt down here. The fourth empire was this Syrian or the Seleucid Empire. Yeah, I mean, this it had all this territory over here. Well, at least it was contested, but typically. I mean, we're talking about several hundred years here now, from Alexander the Great in the 330s to Antiochus is in the 160s. So, you know, talking about almost 200 years. So a lot of things change, but ultimately it's from Syria. And what does it say? He advances what? He goes where? What does he advance? He goes towards the south. Yeah. Goes south, which would be Egypt, which we'll get to that in just a minute. And he goes east. In other words, he's going to control this territory over here, Babylon, what we would call Iran, Iraq, you know, Afghanistan. But then also, as you said, Nancy, to the what? Beautiful land. Is that what your translation says? Beautiful land? Anybody have a different translation? The beautiful land? We're going to see that language again in Daniel. But that's this land right here. That's what we would call Palestine or Israel or Judea, Samaria. In other words, the land God gave to the people of Abraham, right? The children of Abraham. That's the beautiful land. So he asserts, now the Seleucids always had control over that land, but he attacks Egypt, and Rome says, okay, Rome's not in our picture yet at all. But historically, when Antiochus attacked Egypt, Rome did not want one empire ruling all of that territory. And so Rome threatened Antiochus and says, if you keep up your pressure against Egypt, then we're going to get in this fight. You know, because we don't want one group controlling everything over there. And so he backed off. He did not continue his assault on the south. But what he did is he took out his frustration on Israel, on Judea. So he went to the south, but he didn't conquer it. And so he comes to the beautiful land, which, I mean, they're powerless. They're helpless, basically. And he exerts his control and does things that his previous ancestors didn't do. The Persians and the Seleucids all, and Alexander himself, all said, hey, you Jews worship in your temple, do what you do your thing. Just don't upset the apple cart. Live under our rule. And so the Jews were able to live out their lives in peace and safety for the most part, until Antiochus. It says it grew as high as the host of heaven in verse 10, threw down to earth some of the hosts and some of the stars and trampled on them. You're getting this picture of a cosmic warfare, cosmic battle, right? Antiochus is representing kind of the evil forces in the world. And that what lies behind Antiochus is a cosmic struggle between evil and good. Even against the prince of the host, it acted arrogantly. Now, here's the question: who's the prince of the host? And there's different opinions about that. Some say it's some angelic figure, like an archangel or something, maybe Gabriel or somebody like that. Others say, no, this was the high priest. This was the high priest who represented, because the high priest during this time was assassinated. I think it was in I don't remember exactly the date, I think 171 or something like that. But during this period of time, the high priest is assassinated. Right? And you think it might be the high priest because what's the next statement? He took the regular burnt offering away. In other words, he undermined the worship at the temple, the burnt offering, and overthrew the place of his of God's sanctuary, of the prince of the high priest, or the prince of the host sanctuary, or the high priestly sanctuary, the temple. And that's why the regular burnt offerings stopped. No more sacrifices at the temple. And Antiochus is the one who sacrificed a pig on the altar, set up an idol to Zeus, and turned the temple into an idolatrous place of worship, and defiled the temple. So Jews couldn't worship there. They couldn't, it needed to be cleansed before they could worship there again. But Antiochus controlled it. So you can see he's arrogant against the people of God, persecuting the people of God. Right? He died in 163. Yeah, I think he was definitely under 40, I think. He was on the young side. Yeah, I think that's right. But I need to double check that. I'm not sure. I remember that well. Yeah. Huh? That's a question mark. He was involved in a battle in Parthia over yeah, he was involved in a battle. And we don't know if he died in the battle or he died of some sickness while he was prosecuting a battle. So that's a question mark. But he died in 163, if I remember right. Yeah. So watch the language again here. In verse 13, then I heard a holy one speaking. Daniel's kind of got this, he's got this perspective. He's watching what's going on in heaven, basically, and on earth. He's watching the interplay. And I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one that spoke, "How long?" How long? That's a lament language, right? How long? How long is God going to allow this pretender, this Epiphanes, this one who claims to be the manifestation of God? How long is God going to allow his temple to undergo this desecration? Because it says the transgression that makes desolate in verse 13. Anybody have a different translation of that? The translation that makes desolate? Okay. That causes desolation. The what that causes? The rebellion that causes desolation. Anybody have another different translation in verse 13? Now, the word desolation is the word we had back in chapter 7, the abomination of desolation. So are we talking about the same abomination of desolation as in chapter 7? Or is there a different one? So, question mark. Huh? Well, that's a good question too, because Jesus also talks about an abomination of desolation in Matthew 24 and in Luke 21 and Mark 13. So that's another question. Well, the answer is, yeah, this is going to be over in 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, remember the daily burnt offering sacrifices were evening and morning. So 2,300 evenings and mornings. You could understand that as, oh, that's 2,300 days. Or you could understand it as 1,150 days. Because evening and morning is one day. Think about Genesis 1. And it was the evening and the morning, and it was the first day, right? Jewish calculation of days is evening and morning. That's the day. And the burnt offerings were regarded as one sacrifice, even though one was done at the evening and one was done in the morning, it was still one sacrifice. So probably the 2,300 evening and mornings refers to 1,150 days, or something roughly like 3.5 years or less than 3.5 years, but something in that neighborhood. Now you remember in chapter 7, the little horn was going to have power for how long? Well, that's what people think, right? But literally it says times and a half, which people interpret as 3.5 years, right? We don't know that for sure, but if we're talking about the same little horn, it's pretty parallel, 3 and getting toward a half, 3 plus, which is what you have in times, that's 2 times, 1 time, 2 times, and a half time, which is 3.5. Could be years. Some say it's months, but 3 years is probably 3.5 years is probably right. And if it's parallel to the 1,150 days, that's pretty close in terms of timing, right? And that's pretty close to what actually happened. The temple was desolate for almost 3+ years. 3 years plus. It was desolate for that long. In 164 to 160, or 167 to 164 BC. And that's one of the reasons why when we're reading chapter 8, people there's a general consensus that what Daniel is describing is what happened under Antiochus Epiphanes.
But it was future for Daniel.
It was future to Daniel, right? Exactly. It's history to us. That would, and everybody typically agrees with that with chapter 8. The bigger question then becomes, to what extent is chapter 8 another description of the little horn of chapter 7? Or is there another little horn other than just this little horn, right? So that's what we're going to get into with chapters 10 and 11 and 12. We'll get to that question in 10, 11, and 12, which gets real complicated, but we'll get there. We'll get there. All right. So after those, how long is this going to last? There's a lament. Why does God allow this? Why is God even putting up with this? Why does he let the little horn even come and arise? Why doesn't he just cut off the little horn even before the little horn gets started? So how long? And we're not told why God is allowing the little horn to rise and destroy and desolate the temple. We're not told why that was the case. But we are told in response to the lament how long. We're told the time. Basically, something a little less than 3.5 years. So when we look down to verses 22 and following, it says at the end of their rule, verse 23, when the transgressions had reached their full measure. In other words, God is going to use the little horn as an occasion of judging the empire. And God's going to allow the little horn to make full the transgressions. And when it's reached its full, God is going to judge and destroy the little horn. As it says in verse 25, but he shall be broken, and not by human hands. Now, how was the statue broken? Yeah, the rock. The rock that was thrown out of heaven, right? Wasn't by human hands. God did it. And how was this unidentified beast destroyed? God. It was the coming of the Ancient of Days that destroyed the unidentified beast. And we get the same point here, right? It's not by human hands that the little horn is going to be destroyed. It's going to be by God. God is going to destroy it. Now, historically, we know that what Antiochus did to the temple generated a rebellion. It's called the Maccabean Rebellion. Right? And the Maccabees raised an army. I mean, Judea became an army. And it defeated ultimately. And they established their own kingdom. The Jewish nation had independence for about a little over 100 years. They had independence. They were not controlled by another empire. They were not occupied by another empire.
This is before Rome took over.
And this is before Rome came in and took over. You know, the whole Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, all that kind of stuff happening, you know, when Judea came under Roman oppression, came under Roman occupation towards the, 50 years or so before Jesus was born, something like that. I'm not being precise with the numbers here. So that was an independence that they revolted and they restored the temple and they rededicated the temple. And that became the festival. We talked about it last week, the festival of Hanukkah. We call it Hanukkah. They call it Hanukkah today. Originally, it was called the Feast of Dedication because it was about rededicating the temple. And Jesus attended a Feast of Dedication in, which one is that? That's John, is it 10? John 10? Is it 11? I think it might be 12. Yeah. Feast of Dedication. So Daniel 8 is a description of that story of the empires of Media and Persia. And I think you can distinguish Media and Persia. Media had its own empire, and then Persia, a Persian daughter married a Median king, and they had a child, and Cyrus became the Persian king and united the empire. So there was a Media empire before there was a Persian empire, but then they became one empire. And so that's what you have with the ram, right? You have that one horn, and then the other horn gets bigger, and comes second, gets bigger. That's kind of Media and Persia. Yes?
I think language like this compares to Revelation.
Well, Revelation uses similar imagery, right? We talk about beasts, and we talk about, we even talk about times and a half. You can talk about the horns. There's a little horn that grows up in Revelation, so.
Still think it's one of the best books.
Yeah, well, it's certainly God's going to win, right? And that's the point here. Even when God allows persecution of his people, the people of God ask, how long? Which is exactly what we have in Revelation, because in Revelation chapter 6, you have the souls, the martyred souls under the altar, and what are they saying? They're saying, how long? How long are you going to allow this persecution to go on? How long are you going to, the people of God going to be annihilated and martyred and beaten up and boycotted and all sorts of things that are going on in Revelation? So it's the same sort of thing. That's why apocalyptic literature, this is apocalyptic literature, Revelation is apocalyptic literature. But what we can say about Daniel 8 is this is what happened, from like the 5th century BC to the 2nd century BC. Persia, Greece, Antiochus Epiphanes, and then Antiochus Epiphanes was destroyed, and Israel was liberated for a period of time. Right? And that's what I think Daniel 8 is describing. but is describing it under the sovereignty of God. God is the one who allows these empires to arise. God is the one who allows the little horn to come. God is the one who allows the little horn to stop the sacrifices in the temple. And that's why the holy ones are up there saying, how long? Right? But God is ultimately sovereign, and God decides what the end, when the end, what the appointed time of the end is, what the end of the time of wrath is. And the time of this anger, of the opposition forces against God and God's people. And there was a time of the end. But it wasn't the end of time. It was the end of the Seleucid reign over the beautiful land, that the Seleucids occupied and terrorized. You want to read the story about the Maccabees? You read 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Maccabees. That tells you the story of the revolt, and you get some pictures of Antiochus in there as well. Yeah, Betty.
Says, understand, O Son of Man.
Yeah.
That was a New Testament.
Yeah, son of man is just a way of saying human being. Yeah. Like in Psalm 8. What is man that that you think so highly of him? What is the Son of Man? It's just a human being. My translation, the New RSV, called it mortal one. So it's not a reference to Jesus. It's a reference to just being a human being. Like Ezekiel is called Son of Man. Like Jeff was preaching this past Sunday and read a text from Ezekiel 37. His translation said mortal one, I think, or human one, maybe. But it's just the language of Son of Man, a human being. Yeah.
And Daniel was exhausted.
And
Daniel was exhausted.
Daniel was what?
Exhausted.
Oh, exhausted. Oh, yeah, at the end. Yeah, Daniel says, what in the world is going on here? And I imagine he's thinking, I'm glad I don't have to go through that. But just think, we're out of time, but think about why they're in exile. They're in exile because of idolatry. And the idolatry brought about the destruction of the temple. And the hope, which we'll talk about next week in Daniel 9, the hope of the return and the rebuilding of the temple. Well, the Daniel 8 presumes that they do return and rebuild the temple, because the sanctuary, the beautiful land, they're in the beautiful land again, and they have a temple, and the sacrifices are happening. So Daniel 8 assumes the return of Israel, return of Jews to the land where they rebuild the temple. But it's getting defiled again. And that must have been really distressing for Daniel to hear that, to think, we're going to go through this again? That probably exhausted him, I would think. To think about, a trauma you've been through, and then you got to face another one just like it. That's exhausting and distressing. But the hope is, it's only going to go for 1,150 days, right? And then God will restore the temple. Right? May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.
John Mark.